Hello, this is Peter Bell, and I'm here with Mr. Keith Weiner. Hello, Keith.
Hey, Peter, how are you?
Very good, thanks. How are you?
I am doing well.
Monetary metals, eh? Is that the website?
Monetary-metals.com.
Great. I've seen you active on Twitter and stuff as well, publishing a lot of good content and getting some respect from influential people in the junior mining industry and analysts all around the world who are aware of the importance of monetary metals.
You know, it's funny you say that. Just about 5 minutes ago, Nassim Nicholas Taleb just clicked like on one of my tweets.
Isn't that amazing? The ability to interact with all these people at a moment's notice.
This guy was saying that I'm too hasty to dismiss John Maynard Keynes. So I said, "What do you mean haste? This is the field that I study." "Oh, well, you must be one of those people who think the free market's better on everything," and blah 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 blah. And he went on. I said, "Well, it's a little bit more than that. I proved in my dissertation that all government interference into the economy reduces the ability of productive people to coordinate their activities in the economy." And then all of a sudden, Taleb clicked like on that.
Yeah,
very cool. It's very cool to be able to reach people like that.
he's quite the scientist himself there, inventing all kinds of different thought experiments to work with and mathematics and everything. Wonderful stuff.
The world needs more of that.
Yeah, well, and he was pretty bold or independent-minded, right? I believe he wrote a textbook on some options, financial options, pricing theory. It's an important topic that wasn't really covered well by others. He was like, well, how about I do it? And I think it tied in with black swans and fat tails and unexpected events, right?
Well, the standard model just says, well, you have a normal curve, you have a bell curve distribution, and the people who came up with that idea were involved in running long-term capital management, which famously blew up. Was it 1999? And so after that, you need a new theory to say, well, actually, there's a long tail. It's more like a power distribution and not a bell curve. Oops. I don't know how many billions of dollars were lost, but
and will be again, because the history of those ideas, it's not, we didn't invent fat tail distributions anytime. Well, they're always working on coming up with new types of statistical distributions, things like this. But the broad class, the mathematical theory here, it's been in place for a long time. The history of the science and all this stuff is fascinating. Some of the worst parts of mathematics, I believe, or the stuff that I've read, Benoit Mandelbrot's autobiography, and he had some contributions to this particular topic 50 years ago, I believe.
Yeah, he had a really interesting insight that I don't think outside of maybe math and engineering geek circles is really appreciated.
Self-similarity, it's amazing that where it pops up, and to find it in obscure and theoretical places is always surprising as well, right? That you can push so far off into the esoteric aspects of some intellectual system and end up coming back with something that's relevant or seen in nature. That's always a surprise.
Right, you've got to do the theoretical work first, and then you reap the rewards of that.
So, and your PhD again, and so the university in Hungary, is that correct?
It's not exactly what you call university. This old Hungarian retired professor, so he escaped Hungary one step ahead of the Soviet tanks in 1956, came to Canada, and was a university professor in the Canadian university system for 35 years, teaching mathematics. So he always had that math interest, but at the same time, he was drawn to economics, and particularly monetary economics. And so over the years, he did some consulting work for Ron Paul. He was involved with AIER, the American Institute for Economic Research. And so he got to the point late in his life where he said, I want to teach these ideas in a more formalized, he'd been writing and publishing for decades, at least going back to the 1980s that I know of.
Yeah.
And he wanted to teach his ideas in a more formalized setting, so he founded something called the New Austrian School of Economics. It's not accredited, and so I don't, want anybody to think more of me because I have an accredited degree. But all I can say is the work I did was real.
Yeah.
And in my dissertation, I used what I would call the calculus of spreads. So the idea is that suppose you're in a city and you notice that the price of eggs is $1 per egg. But if you drive 20 miles outside of town, there's a farm there where you can buy eggs for a penny. So there's a spread between the farm and the city of 99 cents per egg. If you see that, that means that there is a really gross discoordination. There's either some regulation that prevents you from hiring a guy to drive a truck, or there's a regulation that prevents trucks, or there's a giant tax or a subsidy or a price cap or a price floor. There's something that prevents the market from coordinating. They shouldn't be so cheap 20 miles away. It's so expensive at home. And so if you look at spreads and see spreads generally becoming more narrow, that is an increase in coordination. And if you see spreads widening, that's an increase in discoordination or decrease in coordination. And so I used that principle to look at a dozen or so different types of government interference, and showed that in each case, what you get is widening spreads. That you start out with the promise and the good intentions and, and all of that. But intentions aside, economics works the way it does, and it doesn't work the way it doesn't. And so if you say, okay, well, we're going to impose a price floor or a price cap or do something like that, then that has certain effects, and you can observe spreads widening. Wow. And so I prove something that I think isn't, it appeals intuitively to a lot of people. I mean, the entire libertarian movement, knows at some level that government intrusion is bad, but here I proved it in a more objective way by looking at something that can be assessed mathematically. I mean, the spread is a difference between two prices. Yeah, you can observe that.
Well, and it's such an interesting way to come at that problem, right? Spreads are so important in financial markets, and again, intuitive human criteria for judging things one against another, right? How much, and that example of a penny to $1 difference in cost of eggs outside the city or inside the city, in extreme situations, right? You can come up with some warped examples where there's big costs that would really justify that, but I think it's clear that most of the time the bulk of those costs are really potentially, if they're so large, it's human caused. We cause it on ourselves. And government. It's amazing.
So what Fekete did with the New Austrian School is he said, let's go back to Menger, who was obviously old Austrian. He was the founder of the Austrian School. Yeah. And I think, so everybody appreciates Menger for his development of the concept of margin and marginality. Of course, there were a couple of other economists at the time who also developed concurrently, although apparently unaware of each other, the concept of margin. But the other contribution of Menger that I think is underappreciated and largely not explored to the degree that it could have been is the idea of spread. Yeah. And so I think, so Fekete wanted to explore the idea of spread, particularly in monetary economics, and resolve the old dispute, right? So at the time of Mises, who had a feud with his teacher, Egon von Bauwerk, was exploring the two then sides of the dichotomy: is interest set by time preference of the saver, or is interest set by productivity of the entrepreneur? And Mises said it's the saver, it's originary, and that's it, and you wouldn't hear anything else of it. Fekete said, wait a minute, there's actually a theory that combines or synthesizes both of those views, and that is that one side represents the bid and the other side represents the offer.
Yeah.
And so applying Menger's idea of spread and bid and offer prices to the bond market, that's how Fekete presents understanding money and credit.
And not just the bond markets, but really the capital markets in an abstract sense. Really, you're referring to a pretty broad concept there.
That's what he started my feet on the path of looking at that way. And
Wonderful.
I think that was, accredited or not, a formal school with brick and mortar or not, that's an important idea, and there's a lot of important conclusions that come from that.
Yeah, well, and good for you for doing the work and doing it in a way where it's out there in the world too. It's important. These historical narratives going on, right? And
these things take a lot of time. So I started writing around 2010, wrapped up and was awarded my PhD from Fekete. And there was one other examiner of my dissertation, which is Professor Juan Ramon Raullo, who's a professor at the University King Juan Carlos in Madrid. I published in early 2012, or submitted first to the Wolfson Prize in Economics, sponsored by Lord Wolfson in the UK. It's the second highest monetary award an economist can win after the Nobel. And they were looking at, well, how does a country escape the euro without catastrophe? And so I proposed how to use gold bonds, to do it, knowing that nobody's interested in an Austrian answer, let alone gold. Yeah. So knowing I wasn't going to win, and I was correct, I didn't. But the thesis of the paper is you have to, if you want to get out of debt and transition, you need to issue gold bonds. Yeah. And so back in 2012, in a certain sense, you could argue I was a wacko with a keyboard and an internet connection, yeah, and I could type stuff and put it up there. Fast forward, that idea, they made me a member of the Arizona House Committee on Gold Bonds, and ratified my idea, made it a formal recommendation of the Arizona House. Now the state of Nevada has legislation pending to enable the issuance of gold and silver bonds.
Yes.
So it's like 6 years, which I guess is a blink of an eye historically, but it feels like an awful long time when you're going through it.
Yep.
To say, look, here's this new idea, the old paradigm isn't working. And I think if you look at paradigm shifts, but that's how it is. People cling to the old paradigm. In some cases, there was some validity when it started. In other cases, it was rubbish, to begin with, but maybe more benign or harmless rubbish.
Or harmful and serving a purpose, in powerful interests as they may be.
That's right. And, but years or decades later, the harm is growing and the alleged benefit is shrinking, or there is no alleged benefit anymore. I was at a very interesting talk that looks at these things and came up with a model of a gravity well. And so, you've seen those Einstein-style meshes, showing you have a planet here and a star there and a black hole, and they distort the mesh.
Yeah.
And so the black hole distorts it almost infinitely far, where the closer you get to it, it becomes very steep and you fall in. So he's using this as an analogy for these, sort of bad paradigms. From the outside edges of it, oh, come on, the water's good. Come on, kid, try it. It'll be a lot of fun to get high. And then as you start to fall in and in, two things happen, which is one, the pleasant euphoria is long gone. And then two, you realize you have a very serious problem as you're now accelerating in free fall towards, certain death at the center.
Well, but who knows what the relativity looks like from that perspective? You might think that everything else has gone crazy, that from your perspective, going into that black hole.
Look at politics in the United States today. The tribes of the two big parties, each one is absolutely convinced that the other is stark raving mad, and wants to destroy the country as quickly as possible. And there's a big element of truth in what both are saying. Trump just tweeted today, or I don't know if he tweeted or said it in a comment, that he thinks the FCC should pull NBC's, I think it was NBC, pull their license to broadcast.
Yeah.
I don't like what you're saying, so I'm going to just remove your permission to say it.
Wow.
We're done.
Wow.
So both sides are doing all this craziness. Each side has their proximate justification. Well, you see, what had happened was, and we have to, because we don't. And it's the lubricant on the slippery slope.
Yeah.
And anyways, I don't know what questions you had prepared for me today,
but
probably not in this direction.
Well, to be honest, none at all, Keith. I figured that just it would be a treat to talk to you. I enjoyed the first time there with Mickey Polk recently, and wanted to invite him back and another person who, but neither of them could join us, so it's just you and I here today. And I've been enjoying following your stuff recently, so I wanted to connect again and hear what you had to say. It's scary to think where that gravity well takes us in the black hole. I was thinking about that movie Interstellar again recently, and there is kind of a hopeful message, maybe, on the other side of a black hole. Maybe more science fiction than fact at this point, but sometimes the uncertainty, it leaves the possibility for things to work out, right? So the hope persists, even in places like Japan, which is possibly the monetary equivalent of the black hole scenario.
The whole world is on that same trend, and if I may dive into a topic that I've written quite a bit about, I use the physics analogy of the heat death of the universe. So one of the raging debates, and I don't know if I deem it to be settled or not, I'm not aware of it, in physics, is basically how fast is the universe expanding? So if the universe is expanding below a certain threshold, then gravity will slow down the rate of expansion, slow it and slow it and slow it, and then turn it around. And then everything will begin accelerating back inwards into some sort of big crunch.
Yep, and it has some appeal, right, as a cyclic
right
concept.
But if the velocity of all the various things that are flying apart is above the threshold, which is called the escape velocity, then things will continue. Maybe they will slow a bit more and a bit more, but things will continue to fly farther and farther apart. And then what you will get is eventually the heat death of the universe. Things get farther and farther apart. Space gets less and less dense, or more and more sparse, colder and colder and colder. One by one, the stars run out of fuel and burn out and turn into black holes and whatever. And then you get the heat death of the universe, where things are incredibly sparse and virtually absolute zero. And then and then after that, it's static. Nothing is going to happen ever again. And so that's a debate for abstract physicists. I know that either of those two fates is certainly outside of our lifespans. A couple 100 billion years or 1 trillion years or something like that. Astronomical amounts of time that the mind can't even really boggle what 1 trillion years means. But there's an analogy to the monetary system, and that is we have a couple of things going on, and I think, and I encourage everybody to think of this as a moving system. It's much easier to think of things as static snapshot. Say that 10 times fast. So people think of supply and demand. Well, okay, there's X amount of stuff available, and there's Y number of people who want to buy it, and then if Y doubles, then the price has to move up. But that's a static picture. And obviously, if you say, well, more and more people want to buy smartphones, the price should be rising exponentially. It's not true, because of course they produce more and more smartphones. And so it's a dynamic system where everything's in motion, right? And so we have a couple of things, which is one, post 1971, August 15th, 1971, almost exactly 47 years ago, Nixon says, I'm going to temporarily suspend payment, however he said it. It's on YouTube. Anybody who hasn't seen it, it's 30 shocking seconds of what Nixon says. directed Secretary Connolly to temporarily suspend payment in gold.
Yeah, and the kind of innocuous statement that no one would ever think matters in any long-term setting.
But what he did, and there's no question in my mind that he did not understand. I mean, I think he knew he was cheating. It was a default, and even though the U.S. had the gold, he defaulted. But I don't think he had the slightest idea what it would really do. I think the man whispering in his ear knew, and that's Milton Friedman. Even the Keynesians, even Samuelson had prepared an op-ed for the Washington Post saying Nixon devalues, and they were just going to fill in the blank whatever the new price of gold was supposed to be. And Friedman said, just default, make the dollar irredeemable. So that's what Nixon did.
Wow.
Now, the dollar is what we use as money. Now, people think of money as trading with a retail store to buy food or whatever, or a car dealership to buy a car. But money is also what we use to settle a debt.
Yep.
By making the dollar irredeemable, we now pay debts using IOUs. We use the Fed's paper, which is an IOU, which is now irredeemable after 1971, to settle our debts, which means the debt isn't really settled. You get out of the debt loop, you're not in debt anymore. They can't call the cops or sue you. But now they have a piece of paper that says Federal Reserve note on it.
Yeah.
It's still credit. And so if you pay debt using IOUs or pay debt using debt paper, you can never extinguish any debt anywhere in the system. And so without an extinguisher of debt, this is a term coined, I believe coined by Fekete, or certainly popularized, that what happens is debt necessarily must grows exponentially, because it must grow by at least the amount of accrued interest every year, and more if you want what passes for growth. So think about this from a dynamic system now. Debt is now growing exponentially, but it's not debt taken on to finance something productive, like leveling of, buying another 40 acres and leveling it and planting more more crops.
Yeah.
It's now debt in service of debt, breeding more debt to service more debt.
Yeah.
So what this does is it pushes down what's called the marginal productivity of debt, which is how much you add to GDP for each dollar of debt that you add. And so that is the long-term falling trend. So it's a diminishing return on borrowing. We get less and less return for more and more borrowing. And so I liken that to the heat death of the universe. So what does that mean? If you're borrowing more than $1 to add less than $1 of GDP, well, the very means that you have of servicing the debt is GDP, because you're taxing, profits, and you're taxing payroll and so forth.
Yes.
But if debt is rising faster and faster, and the GDP growth that you're driving by this debt is diminishing, then that's an unsustainable trend that eventually leads to the point where the debt cannot be serviced and the entire system necessarily has to collapse.
Yeah. Yeah.
So of course, what they do is they say, and Paul Krugman would be the first to say this, and he has said this, well, there's no problem at all, because the interest expense on the debt as a fraction of GDP has never been lower. He said that under Obama. He's not defending Trump now, although I think the same argument would
the rates
largely
are still
hold.
low. Yep, they are still there. Yep.
But basically that's disingenuous, because what they've done is they've pushed down the interest rate. And so of course, yes, if you drop the interest rate, then you can service ever more debt with ever less interest expense. But when you push down the interest rate, getting back to Menger and spread, there's a spread between return on capital and interest rate.
Yeah.
And it goes like this. If I can borrow at 1% to open up a hamburger stand that gets a 10% return on capital, I'll borrow at 1% all day long.
Yeah.
Now, normally in a free market, the act of borrowing, the act of selling the bond, will push down the bid price on bonds, which means since the interest rate is the inverse of the bond price, the interest rate goes up. So the very act of borrowing pushes up the interest rate. And of course, the very act of opening another hamburger stand lowers the return to be made by selling hamburgers.
Yeah.
So the interest rate rises, the return on invested capital drops, in a free market, that is. And so those two converge. So if it's borrowing at 1 to make 10, well, after my trade, it's now borrowing at 2 to make 9. And then some other entrepreneur jumps in and now it's borrowing at 3 to make 8, and so forth. And eventually it stops at, borrowing 4 to make 6. And no entrepreneur wants to take the risk and incur the headache, for those last 2 points. But when the central bank pins the interest rate, or worse yet, sets up a dynamic where the interest rate's falling out of control, which is what they've done, then the interest rate's not rising despite this trade. So what that's going to do is that is going to pull down the rate of return to be had in every normal business.
Yeah.
With perhaps a few exceptions. If you're Apple and you have an incredible brand, an incredible technology lead, and you can build a moat around your business and stave off the day of collapsing margins for a while. At least until your visionary founder passes away.
There are people with great concerns about the margins of Apple on a going forward basis.
That's right. I mean, it's not going to be sustainable, and it's not really a comment about Tim Cook. No. It's really a comment about the sorry state of our world.
Yeah.
And so we're in a world of falling interest rates and therefore falling margins. And so all of which basically says if you push down the rate of interest, you have a negative effect on the business environment and the ability, again, to generate profits to pay taxes and pay service debt. And so my thesis is that, laying all this out, we are headed towards the heat death of the economic universe.
Yeah.
But this is physics. These things are in motion. They have mass, they have inertia, they have velocity, they have distance, they have all these behaviors, and that unless you change the monetary system, and obviously I advocate the gold standard and I talk about why, but unless you change the system under the current system, this is where we're headed. And this is going to be horrific. This is going to look worse than Venezuela coming to America. Not yet, not tomorrow, not by the end of the year. I always laugh when the various gold bugs give a date to doomsday. It's one of those big financial newsletter companies was promoting, one of the big names, and he had a video saying that doomsday is coming and all of your pension assets and everything are going to be destroyed July 1, 2018. And so as I was watching that, I laughed at it a few times in my articles, and then I figured, let me take a snapshot of that website, because that website's going to disappear down the memory hole. And so anyways, I went back after July 1, and sure enough, it now says December 31. So doomsday has been postponed, according to these folks.
Oh, Lord.
So anyways, absurd, commercial pump and dump schemes aside, or whatever it is they're trying to sell.
And terribly preying on such important issues, too.
That's right.
You wonder if it's not a covert or double agent, something going on to try and discredit, what is really a necessary conversation.
There's a false flag. There's a conspiracy theory for you. To put out into the world of gold bugs. But anyways, aside from these obviously frivolous, hyperbolic claims of doomsday by a certain date, we're headed towards it, and you can see it in a lot of ways.
Yep, it's the same as it ever was.
You can see if you drive across. So I live in Phoenix. I've driven to San Diego and Los Angeles many times, particularly on the highway to San Diego. There used to be some towns there that have basically dried up and are now being reclaimed by the sand and the tumbleweeds.
Arizona is noteworthy for that, yes.
And so the rot occurs at the periphery and it works its way in.
Yeah.
But even in a 5-star hotel in a major city, if you look at the bottoms of the doors, you look at the baseboard moldings, you look at the corners of the vanity counter, you see all the neglected maintenance. You see the refusal to keep the capital up. You see these signs everywhere. And now there was an article in Zero Hedge today that said, why is it if the stock market keeps making record peaks, there are fewer and fewer people that have any meaningful net worth?
Yes.
And the answer is, if you can't get a yield, you have to sell, you have to liquidate capital.
Well, and you had made a point about the central banks keeping low rates, driving returns lower. And I point out, that's on a going forward basis, right? If someone's invested on a prior return, and they may be able to roll that at that rate, or they may have to roll it at the prevailing rate as, is affected by the intervention throughout. But the people who are coming into that environment looking to invest and do business in the lower, with the lower returns, it's tough for them. But the people who've been able to ride that wave of the compression, right, there can be capital gains on the other side of that, which is a significant part of wealth. And I think that's reflected to some degree in demographics. You look at the baby boomers in Canada and the US, I would suspect that there's a contingent in there, the ones who are financially savvy and plugged into the markets and invested, the rich in word, and they've done very well, right? So it's a push to the extremities.
And with that, because there's liquidation in order to get a surrogate for yield, then what you get is a shrinking pool of people that are getting fantastically richer, or at least they feel fantastically richer. This is the boom phase right now, which is a whole different set of questions. But I'm just talking about people falling off the bottom, people that had a net worth of $200,000, but their business profits or their retirement income or whatever it is isn't really quite sufficient to maintain their current level of expenses.
Yeah.
And so they're liquidating bits of their portfolio, and the bottom ones fall out. And then as soon as you lose your assets, there's actually an interesting analogy to escape velocity. If you have no assets and you're working for a living, you can never attain escape velocity in this system. The tax rate is too high, which is the analogy to gravity.
Yeah.
And the thrust of your rocket is too low, and the analogy is the returns you can get. So if you set aside $1,000 worth of your wage and put it in the bank to start earning interest, pending while you invested in something, well, the bank isn't paying you interest, and so you can never get ahead of it.
Yeah.
So there are fewer and fewer people that feel richer and richer. Of course, nobody's actually getting richer by consuming capital, and that's what our so I just posted an article today that ties a lot of these themes together, and it's looking at the municipal bond market and how the municipalities, we've had falling interest rates since 1981. So the municipalities, all the bond issuers know that rates, fall. They learn that obviously by the market.
Practical
experience. You don't want to be the guy that sold the bond a couple of years ago, and now you're the sucker who's paying too much interest, and meanwhile the prevailing rate has gone down. So I argue, and Fekete makes this argument, and it's extremely controversial. Nobody really accepts it or understands it, and that is, okay, so the uncontroversial thing is if you buy a bond and the interest rate then falls, you have a capital gain.
Yeah.
That's uncontroversial. Everybody knows that. That's probably a major reason why people buy long-term bonds today. They're hoping for that capital gain. What's controversial is that there's somebody on the other side of the trade. If you are long the bond, there's somebody who's short, and that's the issuer. And so if the interest rate falls, the issuer should take a capital loss, although conventional accounting doesn't recognize it as such.
Yeah.
But the way to think of it is, if I borrow money at 10%, and then they lower the interest rate to 5%, and you borrow the same amount, you have a lower monthly payment. Our books should not look the same. My book should look in some way different from yours. That my book should have an impairment somehow, because my monthly payment is much higher than yours. And so, anyways, everybody understands this intuitively. You don't want to be the idiot that sold the bond at 10%, and now shortly thereafter the interest rate's 5%, and you're still servicing debt at 10%.
Yeah.
So what the municipalities have done is they've put in a call option into their bond. They can call it back out of the market.
Yeah.
And so naturally, that's a zero-sum game. The investors hate to have their bond called, particularly in a falling rate environment, and the issuers, put it in to protect themselves. So they've been using that as a trick for many, many years. And you can imagine both sides of this conflict constantly going to Washington to lobby for their interests.
Yes.
Now, the investors can never be successful in lobbying for higher interest rates. That's not on the table. But maybe they can get call options and municipal bonds outlawed. Well, they haven't done that. But in the tax law that was just passed in December in the U.S., they got something which favors their side of this conflict.
Okay.
And that is so-called advanced refunding bonds are no longer tax exempt to the buyer. So what an advanced refunding bond is when a municipality says the interest rate's dropped, we'd like to refinance. The date where their call option is exercisable could still be years away. But they want to start realizing the benefits of the drop in interest rates today.
Yeah.
And they want to lock in that rate because there's a risk, obviously, the rate could rise back up by the time that their call is available. So what they do is they sell another bond, doubling their debt.
Wow.
Put the proceeds into escrow and buy a treasury bond. Now, the reason for this is the municipalities are selling tax-free bonds. And if they have a similar credit rating to the U.S. government, and there are plenty of municipalities with AA, credit rating, they get a lower rate because it's tax-free to the investors. Yeah. And so by a process of arbitrage, the investors will bid the rate down to something lower than the treasury bond of comparable maturity. So they're selling a bond that has a lower interest rate by virtue of the fact that they're tax-exempt issuers and buying treasuries. So they're pocketing the difference between the rate that they can issue at and the rate that the treasury has to pay.
Yep.
So I call that illicit arbitrage. It's not illegal, but it's sort of, there's something wrong with that.
Yeah.
And anyway, they sit there and hold that until their call option is exercisable, and then they sell the treasury, use the proceeds to call their old bond. And so what the new tax law does is it says you're no longer eligible. If you sell an advanced refunding bond, it's no longer tax exempt.
Yeah.
And so that's the investor striking back in Washington.
Yeah.
But of course, what this is going to do is it's going to turn the screws on the municipal debtors tighter. And many of them are already struggling with crazy, debt burdens.
Yeah.
And once the interest rate begins falling again, and once this present correction is over, this is going to begin to hurt. And you've now taken away one escape valve or escape hatch for them to get out of the pain of the falling interest rate.
Well, and that escape hatch does, bring along some systemic concerns, I would think, too. Capturing a spread there, issuing another round of financing and rolling it into a different security to capture that spread. It sounds nice on paper, and I'm sure that it works well if and when you stick to it. But some of these municipal issuers are not the most resolute or prudent financial managers, right? They can end up with a lot of people asking tough questions and need for a lot of money. And I can just imagine horror stories where, in some extreme case, that money that was thought to be an escrow and meant to be secured ends up having been misattributed to general revenue or something disastrous. And the municipality has the twice as much in debt part, but doesn't have the capital from the treasury that they might have thought they would.
Well, I was going to say, even when it's used, quote unquote, the way it's supposed to, there's an illicit arbitrage there.
Yeah.
And then secondly, there's some municipalities that did it just simply to pocket the spread difference. So you're basically borrowing money in order to lend to the treasury, which sort of makes a municipality sort of like a bank in a way.
Yeah, it's an investment company of some kind there. It's speculating in treasury securities markets.
That's right. And then, because obviously the price of the treasury bond could fall, and then they could take capital losses. So they're doing that with leverage. And then finally, as you say, people never ask the questions that they should ask, and one of them is, we've had a number in the last decade or so. I've lost count of how many times there's been a budget impasse, and a freeze of new borrowing and government shutdowns and all that stuff. Nobody's ever asked, what the hell does the treasurer do when, or Secretary of Treasury, obviously in the case of the U.S., what does he do when he can't borrow anymore, and yet the government is running a massive deficit?
Yeah,
and everyone just says accounting gimmicks, and they leave it at that. But what does accounting gimmicks mean?
Yeah.
And I think you just pointed out one of the possible accounting gimmicks. Not at the federal level, because they don't play that particular game, but at a municipal level, if you have issued an advance refunding bond, and then you have whatever $100 million in treasury bonds sitting in escrow.
Don't say it, Keith.
I'm sorry, I have to. Duty compels me. And then there's some sort of budget impasse, and the town selectmen or whoever it is are like, you're not borrowing any money. And then the mayor goes to the treasurer and he's like, what can we do? And he's like, well, I got a piggy bank over here with a mere 100 mil. And the mayor's like, what? 100? What? 100 million US dollars.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Well, that'll keep us going for a couple of years.
We're not bankrupt after all.
That's right. And they make their payments, and the vendors are happy, and politicians can cut another ribbon on another new building downtown or whatever it is they do. And it's a way of kicking the can down the road. Yeah. But you're right. It's dangerous. It's like giving a 4-year-old a book of matches and putting him in a pile of hay and saying, now be careful.
Yeah.
There's something sort of intrinsically wrong with that picture.
And it's the debt deflation idea really at the heart of it. And that's really the operative thing. Some of the stuff you were talking about before made me think of that. And it's scary that idea is still at play. But it's a basic of finance, I guess, right?
Well, I don't think it's intrinsic to finance. I think it's, going back to this spread view for a moment. Yeah. In a free market, you never get a positive spread to do these things. What I call illicit arbitrage would have a negative profit. It would have a cost to do it, and that would be the disincentive. So it's not like the market's offering the incentive to do all these perverse, crazy, stupid things, and then you need regulators to come and say, no, that's illegal. Yeah. No, it wouldn't be profitable to do it, and the only reason why it's profitable is because we have a Fed that's been pushing down the cost of credit. And so then they say, well, we have to pass a regulation to make it illegal to do this treasury bond arbitrage, or we have to at least take away the tax advantage of it. Well, all these things are creatures of the present system. Yeah. And so I don't like to frame it in terms of the alleged intentions, the unintended consequences of what politicians do. Because in some cases, like Nixon, they had no idea what the consequences were going to be. In other cases, if they say Obamacare, we're going to add 40 million new people for free to healthcare, and we're going to reduce the cost for everybody. Obviously, the people who are saying that are lying through their teeth, and they know it. But rather than putting the emphasis on their intentions, I'd rather put the emphasis on what's the incentive. If something is profitable to do, then people will do it. And so, that in a nutshell, that's my whole vision for how we move to the gold standard, is make it profitable for investors to invest in it by paying them interest on their gold, and making it profitable for the debtors to redeem their old paper debts and reissue gold debts by giving them an incentive by making it profitable, by giving them a good old-fashioned business value proposition to do it. Yeah. And if everybody is making money by doing something, then that something will be done.
Well, and it's so different to think of a municipality or a state issuing gold bonds in comparison to this discussion regarding the callable and the bonds where they issue another round to go and buy the treasuries. It's moving in very different directions.
Well, one is a very adverse act that's harmful to your investor. So you sold your investor a bond. Now that investor, let's assume that investor is not a bad guy. It's not some shadowy bond vulture in New York. Everybody knows New Yorkers are bad and vultures are bad. So you combine the two words together, it must be really, really bad. But let's say that's a pension fund. And let's say that pension fund is, I don't know, the Central States Pension Fund, which a couple of years ago when I was testifying in Arizona, basically hit the wall. And so they sent a letter. I don't know, they've got 100,000 or 200,000 retired, mostly Teamsters truck drivers.
Yeah.
And these guys are whatever in their 70s, and they're getting $2,400 a month as their, retirement stipend.
Yeah.
And then they get a letter from their pension fund. Oh, sorry, yeah, that $2,400 we promised you. Well, yeah, we lied. Actually, the new number is going to be $1,000. They gave these people between a 50 and 75% haircut. So suppose you're the guy, you're the manager running that pension fund, and obviously you have a whole bunch of different assets in your portfolio, and you're getting a blended return of, I don't know, 3-4% probably. And the actuaries tell you that you actually have to get your hurdle to be solvent is 7% or something like that, or 7.5%. You're getting a lot less than that already. And then one of the highest yielding things in your portfolio is just called. So you wake up one morning and you had $100 million worth of whatever, Champaign, Illinois bond.
Yeah.
And that goes out, it goes away. And instead you have $100 million in cash earning zero.
Yep.
So that's, you come to your office, it's Tuesday, it's the day after Labor Day, and that's your news.
That's a huge
and now
problem.
you're going to have to scramble. You're going to pay, fees and costs, transaction costs. And you're going to buy something else. And what you can buy on the market today, let's just say, is not 6% or whatever that old bond was yielding. So it's very adverse to the investors. They hate that. Yeah. What we're proposing in Nevada, and when we talk to officials there and legislators, they get this. The key distinction is, first of all, we're not forcing investors. We're giving the investors an option. We're saying, hey, you could, if you choose to, redeem your paper bond and get a gold bond instead. And the advantage of the gold bond is it's not subject to debasement by the Fed, which on the federalreserve.gov website says the target rate of inflation. They want 2% debasement of the dollar per year. Right? And so if you get the gold bond, you're not subject to that. And so I believe, based on talking to a lot of investors, that the demand for that would be off the charts.
Yeah.
People do that in a heartbeat. So it's giving the investors a choice, and it's actually an improvement. The choice for choice B is actually better than what they currently have, which is A. And so I think they will not hesitate to take the choice. And so,
is there any potential to have a callable feature or any rate resetting? Are these fixed? Are the gold bonds going to be fixed rate or variable rate?
Well, we'll see how much control over the process I actually have. These things obviously are political, and I'd be very hesitant to try to say, well, I can decide such a thing. If I had my druthers, this would be done the way a bond in the 19th century would have been done. And that is, no, there's no callable feature. That's absurd. On the other hand, the interest rate in gold is stable anyways.
Yes.
You actually don't need that. And then secondly, I would have them set aside what used to be called a sinking fund. Like many words have become perverted into meaning something different from what they used to mean. So a sinking fund was basically a certain amount of capital set aside to buy your bond in the market if the price fell.
Yeah.
Showing the market that you had the confidence that if your bond was somehow falling for some reason, that you would support it. And secondly, you make profit anyway.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So there's the incentive is aligned. You're doing it because you're buying your own debt back at a discount.
Being your own buyer of a last resort. Who would have thought that we don't need a central banker? All we need is for the banking houses to have unlimited personal liability.
Well, right. I was going to say, and it only needs to be a central bank with unlimited credit if the abuse is unlimited. But if you really have an honest, fair bond, you wouldn't. And historically, it wasn't that big a sinking fund. But just the presence of it meant nobody would bother selling it down because they know that you're going to buy it back at a higher price. So I would have the sinking fund. I would not have the call option. And I would have the state, as I proposed, and this is in the video on the Arizona legislative website. I would have the state be prepared to trade these things because the price can go up and down, not only in dollar terms, obviously, but in gold terms, can vary considerably with the sentiment. So when people think that gold is shit, pardon my language on the podcast, then gold to be paid in 10 years may not be given a premium. Who knows, could even be given a discount.
Yeah.
And so then the bond becomes cheap even in gold terms. And then conversely, if when sentiment turns around, and it will, then the price could really skyrocket. And so the state should be prepared to sell at opportune times and buy at opportune times, and then get a huge fiscal advantage that way. As well as taking out the gold price risk. So today, the government has a gold income but a dollar debt service. So when the gold price drops, the state has a surprise budget deficit, which they don't like. If you refinance in gold, then you get rid of that mismatch.
Yeah.
That's the first benefit. And the second benefit is they can get out of debt at a discount because the market is being told to tender paper in exchange for gold. There will be a paper bond to gold bond exchange ratio. And when that goes above 1, which it will, then that means that the market is bringing back the old debt paper at a discount.
Yeah.
So if you can get out of debt at a 20% discount, hedge your gold price exposure, and have the potential for trading opportunities in the future based on simple heuristics, it's a no-brainer for the state to issue it. And likewise, on the investor side, it's a no-brainer to buy a gold bond.
Well, and those spreads are operative on the other side, I would think too, right? If gold's hot, the potential for the state to really let out some more line and issue more financing, I would think the converse of that.
Oh, that's right. And then on top of it, the gold mining companies will accelerate their activity.
Yeah.
There will be ore bodies that will be put into production. And if the gold price is, let's say, $3,000 by next year, that is not a prediction. That's not what I think. But if the gold price is all of a sudden up and seems to be sustainable, there will be a lot of investment and a lot more gold mines opening. The state gets a percentage of all the gold mined, due to its mining tax. Yeah. So with a higher gold income, the state could service more gold bonds, and they can absolutely. And so it's a great vehicle for the state, and it's getting out of debt at a discount. And finally, vis-a-vis the so-called Great Reset that everybody talks about all the time, there's an interesting dynamic here, and that is, at least for the paper bonds that are redeemable for gold bonds, not necessarily for other debt. So if you have Champaign, Illinois, in my example, with no gold mining activity, this would not be applicable there. But in Nevada, where you have a gold income, it is.
Yeah.
The dynamic is there will be a firm bid on that paper because everybody knows that paper is the ticket to get into the gold ball.
Yeah.
Everybody wants to get into the gold ball. So that actually is the dynamic that you should want if you think about how the hell do you transition from this failing paper system into an honest monetary system, the gold standard.
Yes.
Well, you don't want a sudden catastrophic collapse. You don't want thermonuclear explosion. You want a graceful transition. You want a controlled letdown of the paper. Yeah. And now by setting up this market process, this is the market, by the way, for setting the price to move to the gold standard.
Yeah.
What this market is. But by setting up this market, you set up a firm bid on the paper debt. So instead of having that paper debt collapse and pensions are wiped out and everybody's wiped out, you now have a good bid. And that's exactly what you want as a controlled, graceful, not controlled in the sense of central planning, controlled in the sense of the opposite of free fall.
Yeah.
An elevator going down the way it's supposed to, rather than the cable is cut and the elevator crashes and kills everybody inside.
And it's funny to me to think of that taking place at kind of a local level, really, because all the solutions oftentimes we hear about they seem to be big, grandiose, global ideas, and the powers that be, that's their arena. I wouldn't want to see new ideas go up and try and work on that scale, unless they're establishment ideas, and to try something new or something old again, that makes sense to do it locally. Places in Arizona and Nevada that have mining and understand mining, a lot of history there. And it's too bad. I feel a lot of the history in those places is around mining is about the speculation and the bull markets and the ghost towns and everything. And to be able to talk about, a better way forward in what are relatively esoteric, high finance ideas, to see that taking shape and the potential for that to play out, in these areas, that's the best case may be, some traction there and success, and a track record that allows the establishment at a global level to really take the idea and embrace it and treat it more seriously, right? Because a lot of this stuff is just, not in the canon at all.
We're talking to other prospective government issuers as well as corporate gold bond issuers, and you're absolutely right. One gold bond to break the ice, and there will be dozens that will follow as other issuers begin to see the benefits of it. So we have a petition to the state, to state of Nevada, saying that we encourage you to do this. Would you publish the URL? I'll email you this petition and get as many people to sign it as possible, which I think will help. And one of my points that I'm making to the Nevada legislators is, that of all the legislation going on in this state, this is the only one that has significant visibility outside the state. It's by far the most important piece of legislation going on in the state at the moment, and I think in the world, although that would be harder to prove. And then to be able to show them a petition, with thousands of signatures, we're at hundreds at the moment, but with thousands of signatures would really, and most of them, some of them will be inside Nevada, of course, but many of them would be from outside. Most of them would be outside the state. I think that would really help impress them. Wow, the rest of the world is watching what we're doing. That's interesting.
Well, I'll put it in the YouTube video description and share it online as I can. Absolutely. Anyone who's listened to us ramble on here for the last little while and has any clue of the strange things that we're talking about, if they don't already know about this, they do well to look into it.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I think things go from common knowledge to obscure and esoteric, and then sometimes they can come back to common knowledge.
Yep, certainly.
And this idea that I thought that it was J.P. Morgan who had said it, but then Dan Oliver of Mermakin Capital, I'm sure you must know him, emailed me and said he believes it's from a passage from Walter Bagehot, Lombard Street.
Yeah,
and it's talking about the idea that if there's a shortage of gold in the market, you raise the interest rate. And the higher the interest rate, the more gold you will draw in. And so there was, what I thought was JP Morgan saying, well, if you raise it to 4%, it will pull the gold off the continent, meaning Europe. 5% will pull it down off the moon. That probably would have been common knowledge in the late 19th century, certainly amongst finance and banking people. That, the lower the interest rate, the gold tends to be tepid and, leave the market. The higher the interest rate, it comes in with force. Yeah. It's a deluge of gold. And today, that is so obscure that there's only one man on the entire planet even talking about this stuff. I have to put it this way, Peter. If I was an academic, which I don't really consider myself to be an academic, but if I was a professor on a tenure track or a tenured professor somewhere, and this was some field that didn't human civilization didn't ride on the outcome of any of this. This is all just academic work. I would be super excited because in everywhere I look, from horizon to horizon, I just see unexplored white space, opportunities to generate papers. I mean, if you're trying to do fundamental work in physics, it's really hard to find anything that's unexplored, and it's going to be really, really narrow and really, really technical. And there's only 10 other people in the world that are even competent to read what you just wrote.
And you have to get time at CERN if you're like, this and that too.
Right, so it's expensive, Hubble or CERN or whatever, right? And this is an area where there's just enormous opportunities to talk about this stuff and have these earth-shattering ideas that can change the world left and right. And so if I was just an academic and this didn't really matter to the world, I'd say, wow, this is really exciting. But this is actually terrifying. Yeah. And I say that without, maybe only 25% humor, 75% I'm serious. That so much is riding on this. Yeah. And I'm the only guy in the world talking about it, and that shouldn't be.
Yeah.
If you do a Google search, I did a couple of weeks ago on marginal productivity of debt, I dominate the first page of my articles.
Yeah.
That's insane. I'm not that big a name in economics. It's only because nobody else is talking about it.
Well, it's the results are scary. It's not the kind of thing that mainstream economists particularly want to talk about. I would think.
Right. They just want to say, well, we'll grow out of the debt.
Yeah.
Yeah, but this is the curve that shows you how that's magical thinking. I give more credibility if you said we're going to ride a magic unicorn over the rainbow to get our way out of this than Scotty, beam me up.
And funny to hear you say rising, that the wisdom on the street, in Lombard Street, centuries ago, 1800s, I'm assuming.
Yes.
That the wisdom was raise the rates and draw the gold in, and presumably drawing gold in had a stabilizing effect on markets. So if so fact, I think once that's clear to say, raising rates to stimulate or stabilize in some sense, that's just the opposite of everything today, isn't it?
Yeah, I was gonna say that's only true for gold. When you get into irredeemable paper, it's completely off the rails.
Yeah.
So 1913, this has to be said. I apologize for going this diatribe. 1913, they create the Fed. It was not about unemployment and it was not about inflation. Those were not hot topics in 1913. They weren't exactly anachronisms. People would have known what the words meant, but you didn't have structural unemployment, not in a first world country like the US. And inflation was not the issue. The Fed was created to stabilize the business cycle, so-called business cycle, which was the result of other bad government policies, predating the Fed. So they created to stabilize. But if you look at any serious measure of stability, such as, I don't know, the interest rate, what you see is that everything pre-1913 is a paragon of stability until after 1913, things go completely and totally off the rails. I mean, there were movements in the interest rate, as you can imagine, from, I published a graph on a Seeking Alpha article, I don't know, probably 6 or 7 years ago now, looking at the interest rate on the 10-year Treasury from 1790 through whatever it was, 2012 or 2013 when I wrote the article. And, you had existential threats like the War of 1812, the Civil War, stuff like that. But it was almost table flat by comparison to what happened after 1913. So before 1913, what you have is the market gradually and incrementally adjusting to the conditions. And then after that, you have the Central Planning Board debating whether the economy is quote unquote too hot or whether the economy is in need of stimulus.
Yep.
And so it has to rise to the level that the people in the top floor of the ivory tower would even be aware of it. And then it has to overcome inertia, institutional inertia. It has to overcome academic biases, and it has to overcome the lobbying of all the partisans that are now suddenly their fortunes that are made or lost based on what you do. And so then it ceases to become responsive in any market sense, and then it becomes a tool of manipulation and, of course, for enabling the government to borrow more than it otherwise could at cheaper rates.
Yeah. Well, and plumbing the depths as ever. It's still today, right? It's shocking to see that the U.S. is an outlier with the 10-year around 2%.
We're gonna head to the same place the rest of the world is at. That's gonna go to zero and beyond. And that's just the trend we're in, and it can't be interrupted from within the paradigm.
No. And yep, that much is clear.
In fact, the fact that municipal bonds have had this call feature is in a way a perverse proof of this, right? So if you have buyers and sellers in a market, one side, so you can have a seller's market or you can have a buyer's market. One proof that you have a seller's market is the sellers can put in, not only can they raise the price, but they can put in adverse terms. So when real estate markets go crazy, the sellers say, we're not taking offers that are contingent on termite inspections and building inspections. It's as is cash, and we don't even want contingent on financing, cash only.
Yeah.
Right. Which is obviously very adverse to the buyers. So that's proof you have a seller's market. The fact that the buyers can the sellers, the issuers can put in this clause that says that we can call our bond back if the interest rate falls. We can take your capital gain away from you at our sole discretion.
Well,
is proof that it's a seller's market.
This is, yep.
Which is proof that it's a seller's market in bonds, which means there's a relentless upward pressure on the price of the bond. And if it's a seller's market, that basically means either demand is outstripping supply or supply is falling short of demand. And that's essentially the bottom line conclusion of my theory of interest in prices, is that the issuance, as crazy and ferocious as the issuance of debt is, relative to the demand for the debt, it's actually weak. It's actually soft.
Well,
and so the buyers
or broken in some way. That these two things can never really connect or meet each other in some market sense, right? That may be
right in irredeemable paper. That's correct. And so the other way of thinking of this is you have trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of balance sheet being managed to try to find a yield with always a slight shortfall of yielding products that they can buy to put in those balance sheets. And so the buyers, the investors, are out competing each other to push prices up.
Yeah, which is,
how perverse is that?
It's really puzzling that that's at all a logical conclusion.
And yet you can see a 37-year trend, again, present correction notwithstanding, you can see a 37-year falling trend in interest rates, which means a rising trend in bond prices, and approximately the same in stock markets and real estate. Is relentlessly rising asset prices, relentlessly falling yields.
Well, and it's hard to see that reversing. Really.
And any reversal of it would destroy the whole system.
Yeah, exactly.
Because there's so much leverage. If you deflate asset prices, then all these balance sheets suddenly go broke because they're leveraged up. The low interest rate is not only the enabler of leverage, actually forces you to take leverage. You can't meet your nut unleveraged anymore. Well, we passed that threshold a long time ago. So if you can only earn, let's say, a 50 basis point spread on something, well, you can't survive in 50 basis points. But if you can lever up 10 to 1, then you're making 5 points until the value falls 60 basis points, and then you're dead.
And what about the global aspect of this? It's one thing for these issues to play out in a generation or two in the USA, but if we expect some secular transition, in the power structures from east to west again, or further west again, 100 years ago it was from the UK to New York, you could say, and then this century, is it not from the US to China, somewhere in Asia potentially?
I'm I'm not a believer in that theory. I think the Chinese have a much more centrally planned economy than America does.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people who have become enamored of that and says, well, their central planning is wiser and maybe less corrupt, whatever. But central planning always fails in the end, even if it gives you a euphoric boom in the meantime. What I see happening is the other currencies one by one failing ultimately, because the dollar is on both sides of every major balance sheet in the world. And so that means they owe US dollars.
Yeah.
And in this environment, it becomes harder and harder to generate, now, not necessarily, well, first of all, to generate US dollar revenue, but what matters is an excess of revenue minus expenses.
Yep.
That spread, which is called profit, is the only way you can repay debt. It becomes harder and harder to do that. But if you have debts in dollars and your assets are in bolivars or Zimbabwe or Argentinian pesos or Turkish liras or whatever, then the local currency is doomed. And so perversely, the US dollar becomes stronger and stronger and stronger.
Yeah.
You know, the Americans end up being right temporarily for the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
Purchasing power of the dollar goes up and so forth. And Americans may, for a while, confuse that with good times. But actually what it is, it's the destruction. We'll see if Turkey, so the lira had been falling a couple of weeks ago, and then it had a real bounce when I think it was Qatar, United Arab Emirates, one of those countries announced a giant bailout for Turkey. And I said, this will be interesting to see how long this lasts.
Yeah.
Clearly going to be a bounce. I clearly wouldn't, if I was short, I would want to close the short position on the lira. But this is not going to fix anything. And those countries don't have enough capital to throw and fill Turkey's black hole.
Yeah.
So now the Turkish lira is back falling again. If it falls below the bottom that it had before that announcement of the bailout, you know, watch out. But that's the destruction of untold amounts of Turkish capital, obviously, and Turkish savers and Turkish businesses, and that's happening. There's a lot of currencies that are failing. And the ruble is failing. The yuan is about to break down and make new lows.
Yeah.
You know, it's all these places.
Winning in the global monetarist competition, importing inflation.
The race to the bottom, as they call it.
Well, and there is a gold mining industry in Turkey, you know, and the Chinese and the Russians, they seem to have some respect for gold as well. So, you know, I wonder the global level if you may find that these ideas that you're talking about end up having more traction in places, you know, you're not so familiar with.
It's funny you mentioned that, and you get traction in surprising places. When one of the flare-ups in the ongoing Greek debt crisis occurred, I wrote an open letter to Greek Prime Minister Tsipras, in which I said, you can't service your debt, but when you default, they won't let you stay on the euro anymore.
Wow.
So if you don't do anything, you could probably end up dollarized. I mean, unlike the ECB, the Fed doesn't care. There's lots of little countries that are dollarized. That's where you're going to end up. Yeah. But what an enormously wasted opportunity for you. You should issue the gold bond. And it was that idea. So this article, or this open letter, was translated into Greek. It was published in a Greek paper, and copies were hand-mailed to the Prime Minister, the Governor of the Central Bank, members of the Central Bank, and Parliament. So that got play there, because I know some folks in Greece that were happy to do that. Yeah. But I woke up one morning, we're talking about Twitter earlier, and I had like 30 or 50 new followers, most of whose names I couldn't even read because they were written in Cyrillic. And they're Russians. And so, you know, I started scrolling down to figure out what just happened. Obviously, something happened somewhere in the world. And my open letter to Tsipras was published in Russian. Russian friends of mine tell me it was a high-quality translation. They hired professionals. It was published on a mainstream site that is known to be pro-Putin in Russia. You know, given the fact that people who say things against Putin have this tendency to die of polonium-191 poisoning, I have to assume that somebody pretty high up in the Putin administration would have had to have approved that.
Yeah.
You don't just go and put a dangerous idea like the gold standard in a place where people die of poisoning by exotic radioactive substances. Who approved it? I don't know. I certainly Putin, and nobody has reached out to me or anything like that. But the fact that that happened, proves your point that you can get traction in strange places because crazy, unprecedented things are going on in our world. And, whether you sit in the Kremlin or whether you sit in Beijing or whether you sit in Seoul or whether you sit in Mumbai or wherever, you have to be aware shit's going down.
Yeah.
And in more ways than one. And what are we as whatever country, whether you're Malaysia or whether you're Japan, what are we going to do about it?
Yeah.
And some of them, their thoughts are turning to gold for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it may be secret knowledge, in some places at this point, but the history of it is there, and that's the thing about human history. We seem to be good at finding things that we've lost track of at one point in time, bringing them back again.
What did Churchill say about America? He said, well, you can always count on those Americans. After they've exhausted everything else, they'll do the right thing. I think you could generalize that to gold and say, well, after we've tried every possible way of mismanaging and managing and micromanaging and central planning the redeemable paper currency, the world will go back to trying gold again.
Well, it's a bullish thought, really. And if they did that in context of a global environment where that thought was at play, the sentiment around gold in that situation really becomes something else. It's not just about the local commercial conditions that have been key factors for pricing probably here for the last months, years. But that's the type of conditions where you get a real bull run.
If you follow my writing for any length of time, I'm not a big fan of the this is a game changer for gold type arguments that come up every month or three. But that said, I think it would just take one government anywhere in the world. Well, okay, if it was a African dictatorship that nobody has ever heard of or believes will be around tomorrow, probably not. But if you had any real government anywhere in the world issue one gold bond, everybody in the world, obviously only a small number of people can get in and invest in the bond itself. But I think everybody in the world will sit up and take notice and say, we don't exactly know where this is all going. Nobody can predict how it will play out in detail, but we can all tell that gold is moving into the monetary system in a way that it hadn't been for decades. And I think everybody will top up their gold position and new gold position because, I think America, in a way, we're the worst country in the world for this because we've never had currency crisis or anything remotely close to it. So I think, we Americans, speaking for myself before 2008, we live in our own bubble. We don't get it. Most Americans look at gold. If you say gold and the word investment in the same sentence, the average American will laugh and think it's a joke.
Yeah.
But if you have a gold bond issued by, let's say, Nevada, then the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, everyone's going to have to at least mention it. There's a gold bond was sold today for the first time in 85 years. You can't say joke anymore. You can't laugh anymore.
Yeah.
You may not necessarily want to go put your life savings into gold, but it's no longer funny. It's no longer something that can be dismissed with a breezy wave of the hand. Now it's a serious thing that gold is now being used in a monetary capacity, for the first time, arguably either since 1971 or 1933.
Yeah. Well, and there is a memory somewhere in the American psyche of currency crises, right? And the Civil War period and all that, and even 20th century, all kinds of banking crises.
Yeah, but I mean, in terms of the purchasing power of your dollar, you never...
Yes. And monetary metals, I just mentioned too, it's plural. Wonderful to hear you alluding to the fact that it's not just gold. Great, that's an important distinction.
there's silver too, and we could talk about that in another session.
Yeah.
But silver evolved to perform a different function. It's not a junior competitor for the same function.
And even I've heard copper as well. One person, he said, gold is money and copper is like life. So, interesting idea.
Yeah.
And with all the electrification, there's a big global build out going on. So,
Right.
great. You've got your blog there, Keith Weiner.
Most of my content is on monetary-metals.com.